Housing Arlington coordinator for Arlington County. I'm very excited to be here. We're talking tonight about housing and the intersection with economics. We will have upcoming sessions about housing and its intersection with equity and with the environment as well. Tonight with me, I have a group of people to help me talk through the issues related to housing and economics, including David Christiel, who is Arlington County's Housing Director, Jeanette Chapman, who's Deputy Director of the Stephen S. Fuller Institute at GMU, Katie Crystal, Arlington County Board Member, Mark McCauley, Director of Real Estate Development and Arlington Economic Development, and Mike Spots, Neighborhood Fundamentals, LLC, and also an Arlington resident. Tonight, we invite you to participate in our online event. So if you're joining us through Facebook, you can use that platform to send in your comments. If you're not on Facebook, there's a phone number on your screen that you can use to text us your comments. We'll be using those comments as we move forward in the conversation. We want to keep it lively. So stay tuned, stay involved, and give us your comments. Before I move forward, I want to make sure that we have a good background in terms of where we're coming from, why are we doing Housing Arlington. To start, I wanted to take us back a year to the big ideas roundtables that were held in the summer of last year, 2018. Three big ideas that came from that process were protecting Arlington's diversity, inclusive housing, and planning is never a done deal. And so those three things together tell us that there's more work to be done in the area of affordability and providing housing opportunity for everyone. So those ideas that, in addition to those ideas, those big ideas, there were other things that people are concerned about housing affordability in general, that there's a dwindling supply of affordable housing and housing types that meet everyone's needs. So those things led the county board in the spring of this year to initiate the Housing Arlington program. So there are 6 initiatives as part of the Housing Arlington initiative, including land use tools, which also includes as a sub-element long-range planning studies as well as zoning elements. Financial tools, looking at new ways to use the resources that we have and finding new resources as well. Institutional partnerships, working with our nonprofit partners, but as well looking at other institutions like houses of worship, nonprofit agencies that may be arrayed around the county. County employee housing, giving employees both for the county and county schools an opportunity to work closer to home. The Condominium initiative, which will be an initiative to work with some of our older housing, which does provide some of the market rate affordable housing or housing that's affordable to a good range of people in the county. And then looking at the Affordable Housing Master Plan, looking at to update that to find out other policies that we may need to update, new policies that we may want to include. This multi-year process will lead to a number of initiatives or new policies, new guidance, new programs, and hopefully new financial resources to meet our goals. As we talk about affordable housing, I want to clarify some of the information that you may hear tonight. When we say affordable housing, we typically think about those units that are affordable to people at 60% of median income and below. But there's also a broader range of housing that we want to focus on through Housing Arlington. So looking at those people who are at 80 to 120% of median income is part of our expanded focus. So that broader focus we call housing affordability, and it's something that we're focused on in terms of the Housing Arlington initiative. In addition to that broader range of housing types that might be available to folks, we also are looking at increasing housing supply, both market rate housing and those affordable units as well. So with that background, I'm going to stop now and turn it over to my rowdy friends here for some lively conversation. So And again, I want to remind you to get your comments in, your questions in as we move forward. So I'm going to start with you, Katie. You've been out in the community and you've been doing these candidate forums, and you've heard a lot from people. Tell me, what are the various things that you're hearing about, again, with this intersection of housing and economic growth?
Absolutely. Well, I think you did a great job, Richard, teeing up how this conversation is in some ways an outgrowth of the many conversations we had with the roundtable starting last year, the big ideas. And if I could draw a through line between what I heard from community members there and maybe what I'm hearing community members in recent months too, particularly with regard to ownership housing in Arlington, to try to knit together some disparate feedback, I think people are really frustrated with the lack of options. And that is true for young families especially, who might be looking for a place to buy in Arlington County and don't find anything that is what I've heard somebody characterize as responsibly affordable to them, right? The amount that they could responsibly take out a mortgage for. Or it might be seniors who actually could afford housing in Arlington but are frustrated that there's no one-level living option for them in the neighborhoods that they love. And sometimes it's even folks who perhaps love their neighborhood and are frustrated that there seems to be nothing other than very large houses going up all around them. And so, that to some extent is echoed a little bit on the rental side as well, this frustration that the market seems to be adding only a certain type of product, or maybe the subsidized market is adding committed affordable, but there's sort of nothing being produced in between. So there's a lot of frustration about the lack, what we're lacking in Arlington. And it doesn't always connect to the conversations we're having about growth and our population growth over time and what that means, which was the other big theme of the big ideas. And I think that missing link is this conversation about the economics. Why aren't we getting that product? Where are we standing in the way as government? Where are the market forces kind of pulling us along? And what can we do differently?
Sure. Katie mentioned market forces, so I want to ask you, Jeanette, can you tell us, the regional picture in terms of job growth and what that really means to us?
Sure. I'm actually going to talk a little bit nationally because some of this is a national trend as well. Job growth has become increasingly concentrated in the largest metros. This is because of economic and national factors that have nothing to do with local policy intervention, and there's not much you can do to change that. But what has happened because of that is that our region is forecasted to add about 300,000 new jobs. And I'm talking regionally because only 31% of Arlington households have a job in Arlington County, of any of their members. 51% have a job somewhere else, and then 18% don't have a job anywhere because they're mostly retirees. And that 18% is an important part of this picture too. So we're forecasted to have a lot of job growth, and we have a really large cohort of baby boomers who are retiring, and they like their communities, they want to be able to stay, but given the current product, they're staying in their same home. And so we actually have about 10,000 what I will call empty nesters with at least 2 extra bedrooms. So they have two bedrooms more than they need, they don't have children, and they're over 50 years old. And some of that's preference, but some of that's probably a supply constraint that they're locked in, but they're locking out the young families.
Well, Mark, those are interesting points. Mark, I want to focus in on Arlington. What is this job growth, the pressure in the housing market, what does this really mean here locally?
Sure. We certainly see ourselves as part of a regional market. When we think about job growth, we think about how the region is competing. I think some of the more high-profile wins that Arlington has had have been about the region and about our location within the region. So we certainly agree that that is the baseline. That the idea that we're part of a region and the region sells itself in terms of labor force and infrastructure. I think in terms of our local, that often gets confused with our goal of tackling the office vacancy rate, which is really about fiscal balance for us. It's about filling office space so that we have taxes to pay for all the things that we would like to support in the community. And then in terms of housing, we certainly see housing not as a linear direction to new job growth because, as Jeanette said, not everyone that has a job in Arlington is going to live in Arlington, and not everyone that lives in Arlington is going to have a job in Arlington. So I think the idea that housing is directly related to job growth in the county is less likely than it is part of a regional housing market, and we're a very desirable location to live.
So since we're so desirable, David, why is the county's housing supply and demand challenge so significant? Because we're a popular place, people like it here, we have good schools, a number of great amenities. Tell us why we have this shortage.
Well, it is a supply and demand issue, and I think we've got these values that the community has in terms of our vision to be inclusive and diverse. And so what that means is if we want to maintain that diversity and that inclusivity, it means trying to find housing options for people, households that don't make a lot of money. And so if you're at the center of a region that's very expensive and you're one of the most expensive parts of that region, it means housing's expensive to buy or to develop. And so we've relatively built out, so there's not a lot of new space to develop housing, and so therefore it makes it hard to develop. And we've got the master plan that was adopted in 2015, and it had 3 goals. I'm going to focus on the supply goal. First was a supply goal, then access, and then sustainability. But in the supply goal, we had a goal to try and develop about 600 affordable units, rental units per year, and about 100 moderately priced ownership units per year. Those are very expensive to try and develop in this community. Even on the rental side, it costs about $400,000 to develop a new unit, and we're providing a subsidy of about $85,000 of that. There's other subsidies that go into that, so it's really a desirable place. We've got these values to try and have people that are police officers and hotel workers, restaurant employees and so on, police, the school teachers. If we want them to live there, we're going to have to, through our land use and finance tools, to help them make a space here.
All right. So Mike, tell me anything you could say about what issues you're seeing as you study this more regionally, more nationally. Are we different in a different place than other places?
Well, every jurisdiction has its own unique elements, but Arlington and the DC region as a whole are experiencing some of the same factors that other markets across the country that are experiencing robust economic growth, which I should note is not everyone, so we should be thankful for that. But we're experiencing some of the main forces. And one of the major drivers is, despite what is often perceived as a building boom, compared to historical trends in terms of, if you look at housing production, in relationship to household and job growth, we've really lagged in recent decades, and that has created a long-term supply crunch. And it's not just about the number of units being built, it's about what we're building. So there's a combination of regulatory and land use constraints at the local level across the region, along with some national financial sector practices, have meant that we are not producing the housing types in terms of building structure that are more naturally affordable without subsidy. So it's a combination of those 2 factors that are making it harder for lower and moderate income households to compete for market rate homes. And in that case, there is also a group of investors that are seeking to participate in the market to develop. And the people that lose out tend to be the lowest income households, but that still characterizes specific jobs that are critical to our workforce, especially in the health sector.
Could I ask a follow-up question
Sure.
on that? I love that you just, I think, really put a fine point on the problem, that we're not developing the kind of housing forms that are, we as a economy, as a community, as a nation, that are more naturally affordable. What kind of housing forms are they, and why aren't they being developed?
So you have to look at supply across a number of different dimensions. And so if you look at it just on rental versus ownership, on the ownership side, attached forms of housing, single-family attached homes, which would be your duplexes, your triplexes, your quads, and your townhomes, that still provide some level of privacy, a yard perhaps. Those tend to be, if you look at the data, tend to be more naturally affordable, all other things being equal, if you're looking at the age and condition of the property. On the rental side, in some cases, some of the most naturally affordable rental housing types are the garden-style apartments that Arlington used to build a lot of, and sort of the lower density housing that can still be constructed with less costly materials like wood, as opposed to steel and concrete. But the thing with Arlington is that our land values are so high that, it's not economical to build those in many cases where you could otherwise build in steel and concrete. So it's a really complicated mix of factors you have to look at, but zoning, for the most part, has precluded across the country some of these more naturally affordable types.
Because that's a good point, because we really, as far as producing new ownership units, we're producing very few of those, and those that we are producing are, they're not the $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 price range. They're at the over $1 million for single-family homes. So you've got this large supply of existing condominiums, which are relatively affordable, but there's really not a new supply of ownership units that are in that kind of moderate price range. Would be in that $300,000 to $500,000 price range.
And I think there's also the factor that while we're building a lot more of the market rate multifamily, it's been because of the demand factor, right? Those are not being built and then staying vacant. There's a strong market for that as well. So when the housing providers are looking at what to provide, they're also looking at what the strongest sources of demand are. And I think over the past half a decade or more, we've done so much more housing supply in terms of our market rate multifamily, and it's all been absorbed and it's all performing very well. I think that's an important note as well, that it's not just a misallocation of resources that's actually responding to another strong source of demand, which is our younger renters.
But so what has that done to prices? Because if we actually have seen a lot of additional supply on the rental side, I know there's sort of a sense in the community that rents have only gone up. So is there a difference? How does the trend in rent look compared to the trend in home ownership costs?
Yeah, certainly at the market rate rental, I think we've done a very good job at providing that supply in the market and then absorbing that. But I think if you talk to housing developers, they'll still tell you that the rent growth is not nearly as strong. The ability to provide that housing and to fill it and to make money on it is there. But in terms of significant rent growth, and our rent growth in our market rate multifamily has been more about catching up to DC more than multiples over sort of appreciation. So it certainly falls below what we'd see in sort of for sale single family homes, for instance, in terms of appreciation.
And there's also a difference too between the Class A and how it affects Class B, because usually there's a flight to quality that ends up tapering down the rent growth in
Hold on. Flight to quality. Tell
There's-
us.
And also the difference between Class A and Class B.
Sorry. So the new things that you see, the cranes that's going up, is usually considered Class A. It's luxury, it's high end, but as it ages, it cycles down and it becomes a little bit less desirable. It doesn't have the right amenities. It has laundry's not in the right space, whatever the case may be. And so it becomes a little bit less desirable. And so generally speaking, that people who can move into Class A, the newest stuff, will move into Class A. And it alleviates the pressure on the older stock and makes the rent growth there less it tapers it down some. It doesn't decrease rents usually around this area because there's still a demand for it, but it does alleviate the pressure.
And what you see is sort of the market response of the development and investment community is they're looking at the gaps in the market. So if low-income households and moderate-income households aren't being served by a lot of market rate development, they will target that upper end of that range that's not being served. So if there's not enough new construction in the Class A sector, as you put it, to absorb sort of the household growth and the job growth, people will look at, okay, well, where else can we meet that demand? And a lot of times what people look at are those garden-style apartments that are well located near stores, near amenities, near restaurants, within close to the metro corridor. And they're looking at those opportunities and they are competing for those. They'll acquire them, do some modest improvements and raise the rents so that they can serve that middle market. But the people that don't have access to that housing then, or at least at an affordable rent, are the people at the lower end of the income spectrum. So that pressure gets alleviated the more of that market demand that you could absorb through new supply and new construction, because there are fewer households that are competing for a scarce, low-cost rental supply.
But that's the problem. I mean, the most acute problem is for households that earn very low incomes that may be making $15, $20 an hour. They can't even afford to do the market affordable. So that's where we come in terms of our financing tools, our land use tools, to try and provide, either preserve that supply or expand that supply. And even though we're doing 200, 300, 400 units a year, we're still falling behind because we should be producing 600 units a year of that housing in that income range for that rents, those $900 to $1,500 a rent when the average rent in the county is $2,500.
But Mike, I think you're saying something interesting, and then I swear I'm going to let our moderator get a word in. A lot of people in Arlington, I hear this all the time, they say that our housing affordability crisis is being caused by those luxury high-end apartments going up all over town. I think what I'm hearing you say is it's actually the opposite. Without those luxury high-end apartments, you're just going to see higher dollar renters bidding up the cost of those Westover-style garden apartments.
Right, yes. So people need, if you don't build, people aren't just going to vanish or disappear. So they're going to try and compete to live somewhere. Some may not live in Arlington, but those that do have the means will compete for the existing properties, and they will outbid the people with lesser means, with lower incomes for those properties. So that's why in some cases you see, very rarely in real estate markets, do you see people decrease density when you redevelop, but that's why you're seeing in some cases these garden-style apartments being replaced by higher-end townhomes instead of replaced by more rental housing that would be more naturally affordable. It's because there's that unmet demand for high-end housing. Now, that I would like to stress that that's not the only thing we should be doing, is worrying about meeting the need for high-end housing, but this is think of it as an ecosystem, and if you remove one element, it throws the whole rest of the ecosystem out of whack.
Right, and it's not just the townhouses. I mean, it could be townhouses, but it could also be, as a matter of right, apartments. Right. And those apartments are not going to have the small bedrooms and no closet. When they're rebuilt, they're going to be market rate units with the new amenities and with the bedrooms and the bathrooms that are larger, and the rents won't be affordable. Right?
Just to reinforce quickly Michael's point, the job growth that we are likely to have here, we use housing as infrastructure to fill that job growth. Not having the people here doesn't mean that the job growth forces aren't still in existence. And so what ends up happening is housing becomes a stronger sorting mechanism where only the most productive, and I'm putting that in quotes because we measure that through wages, people can afford to be in that metro area, and then everyone else has to go find somewhere else to be.
Well, that raises a point about workforce and diversity within the workforce and providing for the needs of everyone within the workforce at all the income levels. That raises a question. But I see an important question here coming from one of our viewers. Alexa asks, she has concerns about residents who need accessible units. Is this a challenge the county should consider?
We are considering it, yes. We are. In new units, there's a requirement that if there's a new development, it has to have a certain percentage of accessible units. And certainly on the income restricted side that we support through our land use and finance tools, we actually have a higher percentage. We try to get 10 to 20% of the total units as accessible units.
We want to define accessible for our viewers.
So these are units that have roll-in showers, bathrooms. The doors are wider. Instead of steps going up, they've got at-grade entrances. So it's a range of features that help people that have a range of disabilities access these units. And it's a very important goal that we have. And again, I think from our perspective, we've got an aggressive goal to get up to 20% of these units affordable and also accessible at the same time.
I think it's part of the reason, too, why it's so important that we have financial strategies and land use tools around the creation of committed affordable units. Because otherwise, you're looking at market rate affordable units, which the overall supply of is dwindling in Arlington, but they also tend to be, as Mike was talking about, in aging buildings, which often don't support our residents who have unique or differently abled needs.
Well, I heard a lot here, and what I'm hearing, I think, is that in a market where housing is a short supply and a lot of demand for higher end housing, that there's a lot of builders who will build to that market, and so the middle income person, the lower income person may be getting squeezed out. There's a question, I think, should we be doing more to meet the needs of that population, those people who work actually making good money, but can't afford to buy that first house, that first family-sized unit, and can't afford the rent in Arlington. Should we be doing more, Katie?
Well, I think the biggest challenge, as we've talked about so often here, is there's no supply for it, right? So I think one of the things I think about as a policymaker is what does it mean for equity or efficiency of our dollar if we have to subsidize somebody who's making, say, 100% of the area median income, right? Does that say something more meaningful about how warped our supply has become? So I do think that there is an important role for us in supporting first-time home buyers and certainly supporting lower-income home buyers and as well as renters. I think as David talked about really eloquently, there is a certain segment of our market that we are such a long way from being able to support without committed investments. But in the meantime, when I think about ownership in particular, the idea that we would be trying to support through dollars what the market is so clearly leaving behind is a little disconcerting, right, for all of us. So I am really interested in knowing, what national models we can draw from. I know every community is in the growing metro areas, as Jeanette was saying, is contending with this, and I think that there are probably a lot of land use tools or regulations that need our attention, as well as financial supports.
Well, let's talk about tools.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue, because I think it's in this continuum of housing needs. If we've got people at the very lower income spectrum, that's where we put most of our financial resources. We've got housing choice vouchers at the federal level. We've got housing grants at the local level. That's about $25 million per year. We've got our Affordable Housing Investment Fund, which is the county's loan funds, which is used to preserve or produce units in that roughly 30 to 60, 70, 80% of the AMI range, essentially households from the 35,000 up to 70 and 80,000 households. So those are financial resources. We've also got Columbia Pike. We've got the transit-oriented affordable housing fund, which is also a financial resource to help pay for infrastructure that's needed along developments along Columbia Pike. The county can issue bonds to its industrial development authority to finance housing. We've got speaking of ownership, we've got the Moderate Income Purchase Assistance Program, which is down payment assistance to first-time home buyers. It's to home buyers earning incomes up to 80% of their intermediate income, and it could be a loan that's up to 25% of the purchase price. Then we've got the federal resources. There's the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which essentially is a tax credit that provides equity on rental properties. We've got historic tax credits, which also are used to preserve housing that's historic. We've got federal community development block grant and home funds. So that's mainly the financial tools, and most of those financial tools are used to house people or support people in that sort of 0 to 80% range. And then you get to the planning tools, and this is where we do use our planning tools to support the income-restricted properties, but I think the opportunity is really use our land use tools, the zoning ordinance, the bonus density, the Special Affordable Housing Protection District. We've got the Columbia Pike form-based code. Those land use tools that we have are really, I think that's the opportunity to try and incentivize this more moderately priced housing stock, which could be rental or it could be ownership.
Well, I think that we're doing a lot of things in Arlington, trying to stoke the market to make sure that we have housing affordability in Arlington. But I wanted to ask Mike if there are some examples from around the nation that maybe we could take a look at as we move forward.
Sure. So there's, if you look at the jurisdictions that are trying to tackle this issue of housing affordability across the income spectrum holistically, it's almost like a three-legged stool. And the first, and I would argue most important leg of the stool, is preservation. And by preservation, I mean preservation of affordability, not necessarily the existing unit or structure, but communities are really stepping up to support the acquisition of existing affordable housing, be it market rate or subsidized, so that you can preserve the affordability in the moment, and then you have the option to redevelop that property in the future where you're replacing on a one-for-one basis the affordable units. So you're create an opportunity to address new supply later while preserving affordability today. And those interventions are generally targeted at lower income households. So I think that's the most important. The second element is adding new supply, particularly around new transit investments or existing transit assets. So if you're talking about increasing the number of housing units, can you look at where your infrastructure is and try existing infrastructure or planned infrastructure and maximize the utility of those assets. And really, transit-oriented development is a really important component of that. And then the third leg of the stool is diversification, and that's diversification of the housing stock. It goes back to allowing more of those naturally more affordable housing typologies to be built. And that opens up the door to more naturally affordable market rate housing, relatively speaking. But it also increases the effectiveness of our subsidies for the lower income households because you're allowed to build a more cost-effective product. So it lowers the cost of development and helps you be more effective stewards of public resources. So I think there's some spillover impacts of that as well.
Mike, I want to stop you right there because we have a question from Daniel. His comment is, so much of our geography cannot have missing middle housing, like row houses, duplexes, triplexes, etc., built by right. To what extent are high prices the result of supply being limited?
I think regionally there's more diversity of housing stock than there is in any single jurisdiction. So Loudoun, for example, has a really large number of townhomes, and I think that surprises a lot of people unless you really drive around there a lot. And so I don't know necessarily that there's a singular regional disconnect, but in general, the types of housing units that can be built in each jurisdiction are fairly constrained because of antiquated just zoning policies that were based in 1990, 1960, however long ago they go back to, you would know exactly. And so I think that that's certainly part of it. But also on top of this is we think about zoning as guiding the development process, but it also controls it to some degree by design. And so there's a cumulative effect of underbuilding, even if it's just delaying it by a year because we want to make sure we have community impact. That has a cost that then ends up rolling into the final product. So the diversity of housing stock is certainly a piece of this, but the cumulative effect of just underbuilding even by 1 or 2% each year over 20, 30 years, that's really probably the major sticking point.
But those things have to be related, right, in an area like Arlington where we don't have any greenfield development. So if you're not allowing alternatives to single-family housing, which in the vast majority of Arlington we don't, you sort of end up with an undersupply, right?
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
and our suburban neighbors that have worked more in the planned community process of how the market provides housing
That's
is a perfect,
subdivision kind
is
of.
a perfect example of where the private housing market doesn't need to be told where to fill the gaps. They look at 1,000 acres and say, how do I provide a range of housing at market rates that hit as many incomes as possible, because their goal is to absorb that land and get revenue as quickly as possible. So in a couple of thousand unit development, you'll see the developers will say, I'm going to have this amount of townhomes, this many duplexes, this many large single family, because they're trying to hit as many market segments as possible. I think zoning often takes those off the table and doesn't let the private market sort of react.
And if I could just offer a note on how zoning impacts the existing housing stock as well. When you have very prescriptive zoning codes, it makes it less affordable to do modest improvements to a home. And so the more difficult that you make it to do modest improvements to a home, in a high growth area where land costs are pretty high, the more it makes it more economical to do tear downs with large replacement units that are completely out of the reach of most households. So that is a dynamic that if you add some of these prescriptive elements to land use and zoning, it's not just about what the type of housing you're building, but some of the specs as it pertains to how you build that housing, that you can make it actually, in some ways, many jurisdictions, and this is not just an Arlington thing, make it easier from a process perspective to tear down a detached single-family home and replace it with a very, very large McMansion than to add one bedroom to an existing two-bedroom home.
Well, that's certainly the challenge with accessory dwellings, because you've got this,
Yeah.
if you own a single-family home and you've got these two options, do you tear it down and build something bigger, or do you do an accessory dwelling? I mean, I think we know what the economics say, but it's still, at least, I think from our perspective, we at least wanted to push accessory dwellings and get that, we've actually had 3 iterations where now you can do new detached accessory dwellings, at least to provide an option. And I think that's part of this conversation, part of our challenge is really providing options to what's done as a matter of right now.
I want to jump in because we have another question from John V. What is the county doing to advance smaller micro units that could potentially be more affordable to singles just starting out? Mark and David, what's the perspective on that?
Yeah, on the market side, I think we've probably over the past decade we've become more seen in the housing market as a market that would support that. I think for a while it was viewed as Arlington was always the place you go for a little bit bigger rental unit away from DC, and I think we're now seeing that shift. I think one of the things, not to delve into a completely different topic, but I think one of the things that's often related is parking. And I think micro units often come with no parking. Developers really want to hit that market of people that want to only be in the unit, kind of like the Las Vegas hotel room, only when they need to sleep and eat and want to be out. And often those people are the same people that don't need parking. And so I think parking often plays into that, as well as how many square footage of actual of economically viable housing square footage you can get on a site. So I think we're seeing that. I think the challenge is always going to be sort of going through the process and having that be part of our discussion about these people do exist, they want to live here, and they're not going to, they're going to be great parts of our communities.
Right, and that's a good part, because we have something called the form-based code on Columbia Pike, which says you can fit this, you've got this form and you can fill it not with as many units, but you could accommodate micro units. But this issue of parking, we've got the form-based code that could accommodate micro units, but if we through the zoning or through form-based code require one space per unit, then that's going to make it challenging to develop micro units in terms of the market you're talking about.
And it's often a gradual push there, right, as well. The idea that we've already gone from, in a place like Arlington where the average new market rate apartment had 1,100 square foot or 1,000 square foot per unit, and now we're already down at, the most recent ones are more at 750. So we're already getting that natural push down, and I think micro units is just the next level of that.
I find it encouraging, and this question really gets to the heart of something that's, can be a little frustrating as a policymaker. I think that the viewer asked, well, what's the county doing to advance these? And I often have to remind myself or others in the community, the county actually doesn't build housing. The county board doesn't, the county staff doesn't. What we're trying to do is shape the way the stream is going. And I think you guys shared a great example with parking, because we can sometimes be in our own way of trying to achieve
achieve in the metro
reform.
corridors, we've got reduced parking ratios, and that's particularly on the affordable side. So we've taken advantage of those, the ability to have less parking in income-restricted properties, and so that helps. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but it still doesn't mean, as we recommend developments that have reduced parking, that there is we get feedback from the community about, well, how far can we go? We're not going to, we can get to point 4, which is, if you've got a 100-unit building, we have 40 parking spaces, but I think that seems to be sort of our limit right now. Whereas you've got other places where they've got, you can go down as low as 0 parking spaces.
Yeah.
But to get to the micro units, I think you've got to get toward that.
But I was, to complete the thought, in addition to the things we can do, we're also tracking the market, right? And I found it really heartening. We just approved a site plan in Crystal City over on Saturday as the county board, and they believe, the developer there, that the market will now support, just as you were indicating, Mark, over time, smaller units at maybe closer to a Class B type price. Jeanette was describing the difference between Class A, Class B. So we're hoping it would be really exciting to see some options that could be affordable by design. Again, this is not going to be the right home for everybody. A small efficiency isn't where everybody wants to live. But if you can differentiate, I think somebody said that well earlier, if you let the housing market differentiate, maybe that can create some more options for all of us.
Well, I want to keep us moving here because we're moving along. In the big idea roundtables, the idea, one of the big ideas was planning is never past tense, that we should continue to plan and be creative. And we've got some ideas on the table, things that we're currently doing, things that we're considering doing in the future, ideas to influence the market and provide that range of affordability across all income levels. I think that's the push and the thrust of what we've been saying here. But I have a question for you, Mark. What would happen if we did nothing? Where would the market go?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as been pointed out many times, I think that the idea that regional housing demand, we can insulate ourselves from that is probably not a realistic sort of goal. And I think we typically don't think we want to manage the demand side of it. A lot of places across the country have shown what you do when you manage the demand side. The demand goes somewhere else, right? And that's not a good. So we look at job growth and regional economic growth as presenting some challenges, as we've discussed here tonight, but also that it's part of the solution. Being in an economically vibrant region provides the resources for us to sort of tackle these head on. So I think, if we did nothing in terms of supply, the answer is pretty simple. If the demand persisted, the existing housing stock would get more and more expensive, either in terms of prices and rents. And that's sort of an undeniable fact. It would continue because, as I think Mike pointed out and others, what would happen is the wealthier and wealthier in our community would be able to bid up the pricing more and still maintain a comfortable level of their income they're paying on housing. And it would just mean that the wealthier would be able to afford that housing, and the more of them, certainly lower income and middle, would be further disconnected from the housing market.
Oh, so we've got a couple of new comments in here. So this one is directed at you, Katie. John has a question for you. There are some residents concerned that increased density will have a direct impact on resources such as fire stations, parks, schools. How is the county approaching this?
So I think actually that comment from the Big Idea Roundtables, our takeaway that planning is never past tense, is really about this question. We have our comprehensive plan. We're guided by projections that the county will be growing. So when we do things like we did last year, update our public spaces master plan to project how many soccer fields we'll need 20 years in the future, that's based on the projected population growth. And the idea that we might be further growing, or that our population may be further growing consistent with regional job numbers, has us reevaluate evaluating those plans on a constant and consistent basis. The Affordable Housing Master Plan is only 5 years old, and we'll be revisiting that one. So with parks, schools, other fire stations, public safety facilities, one of the areas of work that I think is really important and something that the Big Idea Roundtables really left an impression on me that we needed to do was starting to think more comprehensively and long-term about our schools facility. Whether it's an element of the comp plan or not is to be determined, but we've really done schools planning on kind of a 10-year basis with our capital improvement plan. And so people rightfully have the question, if our population is going to grow in the next 40 years, where does the next 40 years of public schools go? Talk to us beyond just 10 years. And that's some work that the county and schools are doing in partnership together.
Yeah, we've got a couple of comments in there and questions. I want to get to them. So a question from Chris. Is there a way to incentivize builders to build something other than McMansions? I want to ask you that, Mike. Looking at examples from elsewhere or just understanding zoning and market forces, is there a way that we could incentivize other types of development in single-family areas?
Potentially. I don't want to overstate the potential end results given how close in we are and how high the land values are. But right now, through a significant percentage of our land area in Arlington, the only thing you can build by right is a detached single-family home. So if that is, given that there's a lot of competition for those homes in this close in of a location, there is going to be a tendency to build the highest and best use of that property, which will be a McMansion. So if you at least open up the possibility that there could be other housing types, it may not be as affordable as we'd like it to be, but there is at least the potential of a developer stepping in and say, well, we think maybe the McMansion market is saturated, but there could be opportunities to develop townhomes here or stacked flats or duplexes or triplexes. So what you see in some other markets, like if you go to Somerville, Massachusetts, or other places in New England, is you have a lot of buildings that are the rough square footage of some of our McMansions, but they're 2 or 3 units that are relatively decent size where a young family could consider a starter home. That's an older housing stock, but it's cheaper than it would be if it was a McMansion.
And one of the impediments here is that we measure things, especially in the single-family detached zone, as units per acre, as opposed to units per FAR, Florida area ratios, which means that you can actually, right now we just say this is an acre, even though you can probably build 3 stories, you can only do 1 unit. And so instead of changing that and measuring what the denominator is there.
I'll also say the one thing about when you can only do one thing with McMansions, once you've already made the decision to tear down a house and build, the incremental cost relative to value of building bigger creates the disconnect where a builder will say, well, why don't I build a 5,000 square foot house if I can, because I can make I can make more than a 4,000, and the additional building cost is not all that more significant once you've built the core of the house.
So that gets back to the point I think maybe Mike or maybe it was you, David, was making earlier, that if you can give somebody an alternative to tearing down the house, that's actually, we can perhaps incentivize even before you get to the level of, or at least allow before you get to the level of the McMansion. And so whether the accessory, if the accessory dwelling allows that, or letting somebody subdivide their house so that it becomes a duplex. They can live on one side and have a renter to support the other, to prevent, because you're right, once the tear down happens, the incentive is going to be to build out to the maximum envelope.
Mark, there's a question from Joan about providing tax breaks, possibly as an incentive to ensure affordability. What impact does tax policy perhaps have on affordability?
And I'll let others weigh in as well, because I think you've probably looked at, the reality is the tax part of the economics of the housing is probably the least impactful. If we said 0 taxes, it would probably still wouldn't move the needle as much as things like land cost and construction costs. So it's probably not the most efficient tool. It doesn't mean that it can't be used as a package of tools to be able to look at how you get to the ultimate result of matching the economics of housing production with the economics of what income they're trying to serve?
I would draw a distinction, though, between sort of the upfront taxes you're placing on development in the developer not to develop decision and the impact of ongoing property taxes on multifamily property owners. One of the things that we've seen in other communities is that by providing multifamily property owners a tax incentive on their ongoing property taxes, they've been, in some cases, willing to keep their rents slightly lower. Or arrest the increase in rents so that they can keep these older units more affordable to a more moderate income family. So it's not the answer to affordability, but it can help the create an incentive for the property owner to maintain more affordable rents rather than just trying to get whatever the market will
Right,
come
and
in.
those that have been following our Housing Conservation District story, that's one of the options we're looking at. What are some incentives that we can provide to maintain some level of affordability in some of the older garden stock, and that's one of the tools we're looking at right now.
And the board just gave direction in support of that concept, right? That if you are going to improve your property, some additional amount of that value could be subject to a tax abatement as long as you agree to keep it affordable.
So we're going to move towards the end of our program, and I want to ask everyone to give some final thoughts. So where do you think our focus should be going forward? I'll start with Mike and maybe go around the room.
Sure. So I have a couple thoughts, and two of them are specific about policy and two about how we approach policy making. And the first is supply is necessary but not sufficient. So we need to really focus on the most vulnerable members of our community, the people with the lowest incomes, because as the county redevelops, they're the people with the least financial means to adjust to those changes. So making sure that our existing committed affordable housing tools are adequately designed and funded is critical. The second is that where new supply does help, it also matters the type of supply we're building. So paying attention to, for Arlington, what are the more naturally affordable housing types, and making sure we're making those the path of least resistance to get approval. And then from an approach perspective, we have to continue to think regionally. And there are costs associated with adding population in terms of infrastructure utilization. But as I mentioned earlier, these people don't just disappear. They go somewhere else. So if Virginia Hospital Center has a harder time recruiting critical members of the health profession that may be in that low and moderate income range, what are the implications? So looking at those types of challenges. And then the fourth is that we can project the future, but we can't predict it. So we need to have flexibility in our policy making to and try not to micromanage. Even though planning is important, we don't need to necessarily get to every inch of how it should be designed, and we should have iterative policy making, so chances to react and adjust to market changes.
Yeah, I'm working with David and his team on some financing tools as part of Housing Arlington, and I think what we'll continue to try to flesh out is what are some new tools. And new tools are often sort of, there's not a silver bullet out there, but what are some things we can look at in terms of providing the types of market adjusted tools that maybe worked. Some tools worked 10 years ago, but the market has changed. Some which are very macro level, like how do we really look at housing costs as a relative to overall cost of living in a place, transit. If you walk to work, you can afford a lot bigger house because you don't have to spend in your car, those sort of things, and there are various of that. But a lot of it, I think, will come down to what we talked a lot about here, which is scalability. And if you want to get more resources into the community to do more preservation and creation of new housing, you need something that's scalable. You need something that can attract the right capital markets to come in and say, we're going to make the investment with you, and that means that supply needs to be a big part of that. How do we create the pipeline of opportunities to really get those resources in the community?
Well, Katie, you've been pretty quiet tonight. What are your thoughts?
So I think, as Mike was saying, a relentless focus on the rental side, on our folks making 50% or less of area median income. That can only be done through the tools that I think David described in full for us. I think we've made some progress there. One of the stats that I'm often heartened by is that there actually are now more homes affordable to people making 60% or less of area median income than there were when the Affordable Housing Master Plan was passed. Right. But we are still digging our way out of a tremendous loss of market rate affordable housing. So there's so much more work to do, and I think we cannot take our foot off the gas. On the ownership side and thinking about our neighborhoods, again, I come back to where we started, which is allowing the different types of housing products, housing types. We know there is such a hunger for people to be able to make their home in Arlington County in something other than one house on one lot. And I think to do so in a way that gives our community confidence is going to require that iterative planning on all of the facility sides, right? Making sure that if we're providing new opportunities opportunities for seniors to stay in their neighborhoods, that we've got the senior centers, and the pickleball courts to meet them, or if we're attracting young families in, or rather allowing young families to stay here and put down roots, that we've got the schools planning, the parks planning, and so forth. So I know people look to the county to make sure that we've got a plan, and to keep our attention on the office revenue side to make sure we got the money too to realize that plan.
All right, Jeanette.
So we often talk about housing policy as one thing, and that we're only trying to accomplish one thing through housing policy. But in reality, we're trying to accomplish multiple goals with housing policy. And I think we've articulated two big goals here. And one is supply from the market for the people that can afford market rates, and then supply for people who can't. And they're separate, and the market really doesn't produce at under 30% of AMI. It's not really, it doesn't pencil very well. And so we need to focus on doing that as a priority for the county, I would argue, and then let the market take over on the other end of that. The second piece here is, I think we've talked a lot about flexibility. Housing, the built space environment lasts minimum 40 years. That's how long buildings usually last. And so we're not really trying to plan for what we want yesterday. We should be thinking about what we need 20 years from today and trying to absorb all of our vision of what our county should be going forward. And to that end, I think part of some of the things we've talked a lot about is flexibility, and some of this has to do with form-based codes, which is just saying, okay, we know we want the envelope to look like this, and we know that this is the height, this is roughly the built space environment, and let the developers figure out where the market is right now and address the needs going forward.
Right, and I think just to close on that, I think I'll piggyback off that is if we can incentivize those different kinds of forms that are at this moderate price point, that's part of the gap missing. But I think getting back to what Mike and Ms. Crystal talked about is the most acute needs in this community are people that they're working their butts off, they're not making that much money, below 30%, below 60%. That's really where we got to put our foot on the gas in terms of all the finance tools, some of the land use tools to try and provide and increase that supply.
All right. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight. I think we had a lively conversation. A lot of information was gained tonight. I know there were a lot of comments that came in. We answered a few, but I think there were many more. I want to encourage everyone to check out the Housing Arlington webpage and to understand that what went on tonight. We will give you a summary of what went on both here at the table and some of the comments that we received in the back room as well. Also, look at our Housing Arlington webpage for updates about upcoming meetings. The next one of these sessions is going to be next Monday night, Housing and the Environment. So same bat time, same bat channel. So tune in. Another couple of things to mention is that this coming Saturday there is a Affordable Housing Month tour of HCD areas on Saturday, meeting here at the Bosman Center, taking off at 10 a.m. in the morning. And then there's a training session for condo owners, members of condo boards on November 2nd. That will be held in Alexandria, but it's part of our condominium initiative. So again, thank you for tuning in. Thank you again to all my guests. We'll see you next time. Good night.